Welcome to Olicana Music. My name is Alistair. Today's lesson is how to play guitar fast, the magic of chunking. In today's lesson, we're going to look at how to learn fast guitar licks using a strategy called chunking. If you find playing fast phrases difficult and you'd like to learn a method that will make playing fast phrases easier, then this is the video for you. By the end of today's lesson, you will know what chunking is, how to apply chunking to fast technical guitar phrases, and you can learn your own shreddy phrase that you can take away and apply the strategy of chunking to, so that you can get used to the idea and start applying it in your own playing. Make sure you stick around to the end of the video because everything I'm going to talk about works together as a system, and if you drop off early, you'll be missing components of the system and the strategy won't work for you, so you're going to need to watch the whole video to get the most out of this. With that out of the way, let's dive right into it. So what is chunking? Chunking is a memorization technique that you can use to learn sequential information. You might have already come across it as a method to memorize your phone number. So in the UK, a phone number is comprised of 11 numbers, and you might have memorized it as something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Or maybe you learned 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's lots of ways that you could break up that sequence of 11 numbers, but it's definitely easier to remember it as 3 separate chunks than it is to remember it as 11 individual items or one item that is 11 components long. This is chunking in action. You take something that is 11 digits long and you break it up into smaller chunks so that you make it easier to remember. Chunking isn't just useful for memorizing sequences of numbers though, you can also use it to memorize physical skills. You might have used it to memorize how to tie your shoelaces. Chunking is useful because it allows you to compress something complex into smaller, simpler chunks to make it easier to recall and therefore easier to do. Trying to remember a sequence of 20 numbers is going to be really difficult without chunking. Similarly, when it comes to playing fast phrases on the guitar, you might have to memorize a sequence of 20 or 30 notes that are all chained together without any pauses. To do that in one big piece is going to be really difficult, and especially when you're trying to move really fast at the same time, it's much better to break that thing down into smaller pieces and chain those chunks together. This becomes even more important when it comes to playing fast things on the guitar because you don't have time to think about the individual notes. By the time you've thought about that note, you've already had to play it and it's gone by. Therefore, we need a system that is going to allow us to compress the information that's contained within a fast phrase down so that we don't have to think about every single note. I think chunking is useful for learning any fast phrase on any musical instrument, and this is because it really comes down to the way the body works. In sports science, there's a field of research that looks at motor programs. A motor program is a fancy way of saying how the brain stores and executes sequences of movements. For example, picking up my guitar would be done using a motor program, and playing this sequence of chords that would also be done using a motor program. There are 2 kinds of motor program. The first is a closed loop, and the second is an open loop. A closed loop motor program is one that you can modify during the process of executing it. An open loop you can't modify as it's being done, because an open loop occurs so fast that there is no time to interact with it. So this would be an example of a closed loop motor program. If I stand on one leg, my brain can incorporate feedback about my balance to keep me upright. If someone was to push me and I was to fall off balance, my brain can incorporate that feedback about my position in space and correct me and keep me upright. In an open loop, there isn't enough time for this sensory information to be acted upon. And this is because by the time the information coming from the nerves in your hands has reached your brain, any modifications that are being made in your brain then sent back to the hands. By the time that loop has been completed, the movement has already finished. It's already gone by. An example of an open loop could be a tennis serve. By the time the tennis player has completed that serve and had time to integrate information about what that movement felt like and whether it was good or bad, that ball has already hit the other side of the court. There just isn't time for the tennis player to interfere with the movement of the serve because by the time they've had time to think about it, that ball has already gone. When it comes to playing fast musical ideas, the amount of time that it takes between each note is so short that you don't have time to interfere with it. It's an open loop environment, and therefore we need to treat it as such when we practice. Let's take the phrase that we're going to learn today. It's a 16th note triplet phrase at 120 BPM. This means that you're playing 12 notes per second, and there are 83 milliseconds between each note. The average human reaction time, according to humanbenchmark.com, is 215 milliseconds. This means that you're going to have played 2.5 notes by the time that you've reacted to the first one. Clearly, it is too fast for you to think about each of the individual notes that are in the phrase. So how do you learn fast musical phrases? Well, the answer is through a sequence of chunked open loop motor programs. Let's talk about how to do this using the 16th note triplet phrase that we talked about a second ago. This phrase has 36 notes in it. Rather than learning all 36 notes in one go, what we're going to do is we're going to break it up into chunks and master each chunk on its own. Firstly, you're going to break up the phrase on the downbeat. When we chain these chunks back together, when we've learned them all, what's going to happen is we're going to try and land the first note of every phrase in the right place. And the downbeat is a really obvious beat that will make it easy to do that. So breaking up our phrase on the downbeat is a really good way to make sure that it's easy to land the first note of every chunk in the right place. Although this phrase has nice groupings of 6, you can do this with any groupings of notes. So if you had a phrase that had a group of 3, and then a group of 6, and then a group of 4, as long as you're breaking the chunks up on the downbeat, you'll be good to go. In my experience, chunks need to be at least 3 notes in length, and probably no more than 8. The reason for this is because it's about optimizing the compression of information. If you're less than 3 notes, you're not really compressing anything down, you're still thinking about the individual notes really. And if you go above 8, you're trying to compress too much information into the chunk, and it's going to be harder for you to spot mistakes. So in my opinion, and what works best for me, is that chunks need to be at least 3 notes long and no more than 8 notes. The only way you're going to be able to learn to play a phrase like the one we're going to learn today is by practicing it in an open loop environment. If you try and practice the whole phrase in an open loop environment, all 36 notes, it's going to go by so fast that you're not going to be able to spot the mistakes that you're making. However, by breaking it into chunks and that are small and not got too many notes in, we can tell the mistakes we're making, we can spot them easily, we can solve them, and we can do this for each individual chunk, and then we can chain those chunks together when we're done. Now that you have broken your phrase into chunks, we can practice and master each chunk on its own. Starting with the first chunk, what you're going to do is you're going to play it slowly so that you can get an idea of which finger needs to go there, where, and which pick stroke you need to do on each note. We're going to do this so that it's kind of memorized and we can be absolutely certain of what correct looks like when we play the phrase fast. You need to know what the phrase sounds like slowly in order to be able to spot the mistakes that you're inevitably going to make when you try to play the phrase fast. There, I could think about every note that I was playing, I could think about every individual movement, and this is important because I can tell when I'm making a mistake there. I know that that chunk was played perfectly at a slow speed, and it's now ready to be taken into an open loop environment because I'm going to be able to spot the mistakes I make when I practice it that fast. Once you can play a chunk slowly and cleanly, then you can start to ramp up the speed to find your open loop tempo. This is kind of different for everybody and depends on the phrase as well. But what you can do is you take your little chunk and you start to speed it up until you find a point where you can't think about the individual notes anymore. What will happen is either the chunk will fall apart or you'll be able to play it, but you'll only really be able to concentrate on the first note of the chunk. So there I've kind of found my open loop tempo. I could only really focus on the first note of each repetition. Because I can already play the phrase, obviously it's not falling apart for me, but for you, you might find that you can't even do it cleanly at that point. It just kind of collapses on itself. When you find that tempo where you can't play the phrase anymore, that's good. That's the minimum tempo we're going to be practicing at from now on. The reason that we're not going to play this phrase any slower than an open loop speed is because you need to practice it in an open loop environment in order to master it. The way your brain processes closed loop movements versus open loop movements is different. And therefore, if you want to master something that is fast, you have to practice it as an open loop. The purpose of practicing in a closed loop when it's slow is so that you can tell what correct is meant to look like. But when you know what correct is meant to be, you need to put the gas on and play it in an open loop environment so your brain can get a sense of what it's like to play these movements as a chunk, as an open loop. Any mistakes that you do make in an open loop environment need to be corrected in an open loop environment. Because if you try and correct them in a closed loop environment, they simply won't carry across. And you might have experienced this before. I certainly experienced it when I was learning how to play fast. I would learn something and then I'd try to speed it up and I couldn't do it fast, so I'd keep practicing it slowly and it would never get any quicker. And the reason was because I was practicing in the wrong environment. I was practicing in a closed loop and I wasn't trying to solve the problems in my phrase in an open loop environment. If you want to correct your mistakes, you have to do it in an open loop environment, and you're going to have to make those mistakes in order to fix them. So when it comes to practicing like this, don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's part of the process. As long as you're trying to fix them, they won't get ingrained into your playing. Now you have found your open loop tempo, what you're going to do is you're going to play the phrase once at this speed. You're not going to turn it into a loop, you're just going to play the chunk once on its own. So that would look like this. And that's it, I'm done. You're going to keep trying that until you get it right. And when you get it right, you're going to try and go a little bit faster again. If you make mistakes or the chunk falls apart, that's okay. This is like taking shots at the basketball hoop. To begin with, you're going to miss a lot, but because you can see the mistakes you're making and the chunk is really small, you should be able to try and attempt to correct the mistakes on each attempt. And therefore, with each attempt, hopefully you're getting a little bit closer to sinking the ball in the hoop. And if you try enough times, you'll probably succeed, even if it's by accident. And when you do succeed, you need to spot that and acknowledge it to yourself and go, oh, that's what the phrase is meant to be like when I play it at this speed. Missing is part of the process. As long as you keep trying to correct the mistakes you're making, eventually you're going to sink that ball. One thing to remember is, like I said earlier, don't let the chunk form a loop. If you let the chunk form a loop, you'll probably miss the mistakes you're making because you're more concerned about getting the reps out. You've got to make sure that each attempt is discrete so that you can spot what mistakes you're making and try to fix them on your next attempt. If you just loop it round and round and round, you're probably just concentrating on playing it, and what you're doing there is actually you're trying to chain one chunk into the next chunk into the next chunk, which is a more advanced thing to be doing. We're not at that stage of the process yet, so just focus on having attempts. Play the chunk once, leave a little bit of a gap and evaluate how well it went. Have another gap go and try and fix the mistakes you made in your previous attempt. Throughout this entire process, be trying to push the tempo that you're doing it at. If you're starting to get it clean consistently, try to go a little bit faster again. This is like stepping further and further away from the basketball hoop as you get more confident. In my opinion, you should always be at that speed where it feels like you're going to fall over. It feels like you're going to trip and make a mistake. That's the perfect environment because it's pushing you. You don't want to be going so fast that you can't do it right at all, but you want to be going fast enough where you've got a solid go at getting it right, but you also might get it wrong. I know that that goes against the grain for what people advise when learning how to play fast. There's this idea that gets perpetuated that if you make a mistake, it will somehow get baked into your playing permanently. But in my experience, this simply isn't true so long as you're trying to correct the mistakes you're making. You have to be humble and be honest with yourself and ask yourself the question, was that phrase clean enough? Am I happy with the phrase at that speed? Is my chunk clean as I play it? And if the answer is no, you need to keep trying until that cleanliness appears. If you keep attempting it, what starts as a fluke will eventually become reliable and consistent. Some people prefer to use a metronome for this kind of practice, so let's look at how you can do that. To begin with, as before, you need to learn to play the phrase slowly so that you can spot any mistakes that you're making as you try to speed it up. Once there, set the metronome to a tempo which is comfortable where you can do it correct, and practice and play the phrase once and try to get it correct. So you're going to start at a reasonable tempo, maybe like 60 BPM for this, and you just try and play the phrase clean once. Once you play the phrase clean once, bump up that BPM by 5 BPM and try to do it again. Once you play the phrase clean once at this tempo, bump up the BPM by 5 again, and then try to play the phrase clean again at the new tempo. Stick at any tempo until you get it correct. So if you got to 75 BPM and now you don't get it right, stay at 75 until you get the phrase clean once. Rinse and repeat this process until you hit your target tempo. As soon as you get the phrase clean once, bump up the BPM by 5. This ensures that you're constantly pushing yourself, and then all you do is if you get a point where you hit a ceiling and you can't get any faster, you keep trying at that tempo until you get it clean once, or if you're stuck there a while, maybe a couple of days, reduce the tempo by 10 to 20 BPM and stay there for a little while until it becomes more reliable, and then start that process again of I play it right once, push the BPM by 5, I get it right once again, bump the BPM up by 5 again. Remember that improvement is going to be seen over the course of days, maybe even weeks. This isn't the kind of thing that you're going to be able to do overnight. But if you're persistent and you train in this way as if you were going to the gym and lifting weights, you will find that your base speed starts to improve. Throughout this whole process, you should be looking for a sense of smoothness as you're playing. It's not that it's going to be effortless. It's actually going to require some effort to play fast, just as sprinting requires some effort. But it should feel smooth as you play. It shouldn't feel like there's resistance. If there's resistance, look at how you're holding the pick, look at how the pick is contacting the strings. This is a whole lesson on itself on how to use the pick against the strings. And if you'd like a video on that, let me know in the comments because I'm more than happy to make it for you. Whether you're using a metronome or not, keep pushing your tempo until you hit your target tempo with the first chunk. As soon as you've done the first chunk, you should keep practicing it in the background, but you can move on to the second chunk in the phrase. You'll probably find you crack this one a little bit faster because it's very similar to the first. Rinse and repeat this whole process until you've mastered all of the chunks that make up the phrase. Once you've mastered each of the chunks in isolation and you can play them all at the target tempo, then what you're going to do is try and start chaining some of these chunks together. First, we're going to start with chunks 1 and chunk 2. What you're going to do is you're going to play chunk 1 at your target tempo, and then the first note of chunk 2 is going to be added onto the end. So we've got chunk 1, and then the first note of chunk 2. So you're going to get this. And you're going to try and do that at your target tempo if you can. But of course, you can always start slower so that you can make sure what right is. Make sure you're sure, okay, what does this sound like when I do it correctly? And once you know what right is, then you can try and do it fast. Try and do it at your target tempo. The reason that we want to focus on connecting the first note of chunk 2 to the whole of chunk 1 first is because often the points at which chunks are connected tend to be, in at least my experience, a little more complicated than the chunk themselves. They might contain a string crossing, maybe they contain a position shift. Things like that make connecting the chunks more difficult than necessarily just playing the chunk in a loop. Make sure you're connecting the phrases properly, and once the connection is solved, you'll be able to start chaining the whole of the two chunks together. This is a way of optimizing your practice by focusing on the problems that are there. You could, of course, just go straight into playing both chunks together, but because the connection point often poses a problem for people, it makes sense to focus on that specific problem and solve that before you try and solve anything else. If you would like more advice on how to practice in this manner, check out my free ebook, Perfect Practice. The link is in the description. If you can connect the first note of chunk 2 to the whole of chunk 1, then maybe try and play chunk 1 and chunk 2 together. Focus on playing the first note of chunk 2 and let muscle memory take care of the rest of the phrase. If you're at the point where you can connect the first note of chunk 2 to the whole of chunk 1, but you're finding it hard to add all of chunk 2 to chunk 1, then what you can try to do is just add a note of chunk 2 at a time. So you'll play chunk 1 and then the first note of chunk 2, and then chunk 1 and then the first 2 notes of chunk 2, and then you'll play chunk 1 and then the first 3 notes of chunk 2. At a certain point, what you're going to find is muscle memory kicks in and the whole of chunk 2 cascades into itself. This is what that practice would kind of look like. You're going to play chunk 1 and then the first note of chunk 2. And I'm going to get good at that, I'm going to master that. And then once I can do that, I'm going to play chunk 1 and then the first 2 notes of chunk 2. And then I'm going to master that, and then I'm going to learn chunk 1 and the first 3 notes of chunk 2. And I'm going to rinse and repeat that process until the whole of chunk 2 is constructed. In my experience, you'll hit note 3 or 4 and the whole chunk will just kind of cascade into itself because of muscle memory. When you've connected chunk 1 to chunk 2, then you can try and add chunk 3. So you're going to do it in exactly the same way as we did chunk 2. You play chunk 1, chunk 2, then the first note of chunk 3. And then you're going to try and do chunk 1, chunk 2, and then the whole of chunk 3. Once you've mastered chunk 1, chunk 2, and chunk 3, add chunk 4 on in the same way. And then you add chunk 5 on in the same manner, and chunk 6 on until you can do the whole thing. When you start to chain lots of chunks together, remember it's about landing the first note of each chunk in the right place. So make sure you're trying to land note 1 of every single chunk in time on the downbeat. And if you've learned the chunk properly and you've memorized the subdivision as part of that, the subdivision will take care of itself. The hardest thing about playing fast is getting it in time. So if the subdivision is good in each chunk, you just got to make sure that the first note of each chunk lands in the right place. Chunking as a method will work for any fast technical phrase on the guitar, or any instrument for that matter. Whether it is sweep picking, alternate picking, legato, tapping, you name the technique, if you work in chunks, you'll find that you're able to make progress faster and with less frustration. And just make sure that as you're practicing this way, you're staying in that open loop environment and you're pushing yourself, you're putting the gas on, and that'll make sure that your tempo is increasing. But by working in chunks, you're keeping the number of problems you're trying to solve really small, and therefore, hopefully you'll be able to make it clean, your hands will be synchronized, and you'll be able to stay in time as you do so. If you learned something new in this lesson, make sure you leave the video a like, and if you know any guitar players that you think it might help, make sure you share the video with them. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below and I'll get back to you. Next week's lesson will be on phrasing and how to sound less like a scale when you improvise. If that sounds like it'd be something that'd be interesting to you, make sure you hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you're notified when that video is released. If you'd like the tab for the phrase from this lesson, the backing track from the intro jam, and a step-by-step walkthrough of how to practice the topic of chunking that we talked about in this lesson today, you can find it all in the lesson pack for this lesson, and it's on my website, olicanamusic.com. You can find the link in the description. It's a pay-what-you-want model for £1 a month, and that gets you access to every lesson pack that I put out for all my YouTube lessons, and it's a really great way to support what I'm doing here on YouTube. That's it for this week. Thank you for watching. Good luck practicing chunking and accelerating your guitar playing, and I'll see you for our lesson next Saturday.